In this video, I'll take you through 100-ish years of Qantas aircraft here on display at the QANTAS Founders Museum in Longreach, the regional Queensland town where the Qantas adventure begun. Well, it actually started in Winton, but moved here 1 year later. We'll look at the first plane, the Avro 504K, the first Qantas plane with a toilet, the flight where the crew just wore their undies, the first to fly around the world, and the incredible Queen of the Skies. It's going to be a long video, so let's get into it. I'm Paul Stewart and I make videos about planes and one rocket. This includes reviews of flights around the world and guided tours through interesting aircraft in museums. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. This is an updated version of a similar video I filmed a few years ago, but with a lot more information and footage.
Now we'll get back to those aircraft behind me shortly, but first some history. So the Qantas story began in World War I in Palestine, where Hudson Fysh and Paul McGuinness were fighting together there for the Royal Australian Air Corps. When they came back to Australia, they really thought there was something in these new magic flying horses, so they started NNTQAS, which stood for the Northern Territory and Queensland Aerial Service. Thankfully, when they actually got around to registering the company, they changed the letters around and it became Qantas, the Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Service. And that was in Winton, which is actually just near Longreach, where I am now. Then in 1922, they moved their headquarters to Longreach here, and behind me is the actual building that was built in 1922, where the Qantas story began. Later on, we'll go inside there, but in the meantime, let's head inside the museum and we'll check out the first ever aircraft Qantas flew with, the Avro 504K.
It was a British biplane military trainer that could carry 2 passengers. It was powered by a Sunbeam Dayak inline 6-cylinder engine and was started by the pilot turning a geared crank handle inside the cockpit. It produced around 106 horsepower at a speed of 1,200 RPM. The reality was that no one really knew about flying in those days, so this aircraft was used primarily to promote the idea of flying by taking people on joyrides and as a taxi. The income was sporadic, and they knew that they needed a stable cash flow that would be provided by flying mail, and they eventually got a government contract which allowed them to expand.
So here we are outside the front of the actual shed where the Qantas journey began. So let's head inside and check out 2 incredibly significant aircraft that they have on display in here.
The Qantas fleet essentially consisted of converted military aircraft, and flying wasn't particularly glamorous. The passengers were exposed to the weather, including the wind and rain, although even worse was the oil being spat out of the engines in front of them. Because of this, passengers were encouraged to keep their mouths shut. In 1924, Qantas purchased their first aircraft that was designed with passenger comfort in mind, the Havilland DH-50. It could carry 4 passengers, and significantly, they were in an enclosed cabin, so they no longer had to wear goggles and a helmet, and open their mouths without the risk of oil ingestion. The pilots would sit up and behind them being exposed to the weather though. Here's me climbing into a replica cabin, demonstrating just how much room there would have been for the 4 passengers. It's certainly comfier than the 504K from earlier, but not by much. It was expensive to fly these aircraft from the UK, so for £100 they purchased the license to build these, and they went on to construct several in this very same hangar that we're currently standing in. So at one end was the aircraft assembly line and a maintenance shed at the other. In 1927, Hudson Fysh flew one of these to Normanton and created quite a stir because he was able to deliver a newspaper that was only 3 days old. Then in 1928, the Royal Flying Doctor Service teamed up with Qantas, who reconfigured their first DH-50 to allow room for a stretcher. Moving on to 1929, Qantas purchased 2 large DH-61 giant Moths, although the engines were notoriously unreliable and the aircraft was retired only a few years later for that very reason. But what was most significant was inside the cabin. While the pilot was again upstairs and exposed to the weather, the 7 passengers enjoyed relative luxury with the first onboard toilet, and importantly, windows they could open, which was important when you consider the whole toilet thing. Up until then, passengers would give the pilot a coin for the pleasure of landing and running behind a tree. The only way for the pilot to communicate with passengers was by passing written notes through this small hole, and often it was to advise everyone of an unscheduled landing due to engine problems. You may have noticed that the early Qantas aircraft were named after Greek gods. The DH-50 was named Iris, and this one was named Apollo, who was the god of poetry and music. Later on, Qantas started naming the aircraft after aviators and towns. In fact, one of the most recent Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners was named Longreach after this very same town that we're in. Just to confuse things, Qantas also added the Longreach name to the 747-400s, but that wasn't a specific aircraft name, but instead the name given to that series. So each 747-400 also came with its own specific name. So this one, VH Oscar Echo India, was both Longreach and its name Sejuna printed on it as well.
So let's head back in the main section, and I promise you we will get to the much larger aircraft shortly. In 1934, the British Imperial Airways and Qantas together formed Qantas Imperial Airways. So Qantas would fly from Australia up to Singapore, and then the British Imperial Airways would then continue the flights on to London.
They ordered several 4-engined DH-86s, although 2 crashed and they were temporarily withdrawn from service, with the old DH-50s and 61s taking over the route. They discovered the problems was with the tail fins, and once that had been fixed, they returned to the sky. They were fast and comfortable, offering overhead air vents, unlike many jets these days, and reading lights, which was an incredible luxury for that era. To meet the connecting flights on time, the trip between Brisbane and Singapore had a 500-kilometre stretch during the dark, which was something that Hudson Fysh thought was too dangerous. When they were competing for mail contracts, the trains could always continue to drive during the night while the planes were grounded, so they came up with the idea of building a line of essentially lighthouses for the planes to follow in the dark. Here you can see a model, and behind it is part of an actual tower they built, with a powerful rotating light on the top. There were 6 of these that were spread across their route, and kerosene lamps were used to light up the runways. But the DH-86s just weren't big enough, and from 1938 they were replaced by the short S23 Empire Class flying boat. As the name suggests, these had the benefit of an infinite number of runways, being able to land on water. As aircraft reliability was still in its infancy, everyone felt more comfortable flying over water if they knew that they could land on it in an emergency, even though the rough ocean waves might make that idea fairly dangerous. The flying boats really brought in a new era of luxury flying. The 15 passengers spent their 9 days flying between Sydney and London in luxury, although the ticket cost was an average annual salary, therefore it was only for the rich and famous. Let's head back outside again and to the full-sized aircraft. The airline's expansion changed shape with the outbreak of World War II, which brings us to the next aircraft, the consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat. This had the added benefit of being able to land on water, but also had an extendable landing gear so that it could easily land on a hard surface. Australia's connection with Britain was via Singapore, but as the Japanese moved further south, this was no longer safe. So from 1943, Qantas Empire Airways flew the world's longest route from Perth to Sri Lanka. The flight took 28 hours and was known as the double sunrise flight, as everyone would see the sunrise twice in the same flight. As we look into the interior, it really beggars belief how they survived such a long flight. I don't know about you, but after around 8 hours inside a plane, I get very fidgety, let alone 28 hours. It used to be really hot initially, as the plane was so overloaded with fuel that it only flew a few hundred meters above the water until it burned off enough fuel to reach a higher and cooler altitude. Apparently it was commonplace to look into the flight deck and see the crew cooking away in their undies. The whole flight was flown in radio silence, and you can see that this was painted grey on top and blue underneath to help avoid detection from enemy ships and aircraft. There's an airworthy example operating out of the Havilland Aviation Museum just south of Sydney, and it's a treat to see and to hear her fly.
And next up is a true legend of aviation design, the Douglas DC-3.
This aircraft revolutionised aviation design and was actually the first airliner to have a circular fuselage. Up until now, they were more squarish with vertical sides. In fact, you can see this clearly on this aircraft's predecessor, the Douglas DC-2, on display in Seattle. The circular shape was found to be much stronger, as well as being more aerodynamic. Another advance was the introduction of fillets, which were these smooth and aerodynamic connections between the wing and fuselage that reduced drag. The DC-3 was also known for being incredibly easy to fly. In fact, in 1957, a USAF DC-3, well, the military version, the C-47, ran out of fuel, so the crew lowered the landing gear and bailed out, expecting it would crash. But the plane glided down and landed perfectly, well, close enough to, on a cornfield. While these aircraft were not pressurized, they were able to fly at higher altitudes, avoiding bad weather, and were faster than other airliners from the same era. Like this aircraft, most of the Qantas DC-3s were converted from the military C-47s, as there were literally thousands of them left over from World War II. Another interesting design feature is that it's a tail dragger, which means that the tail sits low to the ground. This had the added advantage of lowering the total height of the vertical stabilizer, thus allowing it to fit inside hangars from that era. A negative, though, was that the cockpit view was impaired because the nose was sticking up in the sky, and the ground handling was more difficult.
So a whole new generation of aircraft arrived in 1947, the Lockheed Constellation, and then shortly after that was the Lockheed Super Constellation, which you see behind me.
This aircraft was a very unique shape, and I'll explain why. The idea was to give it very large and powerful engines which wouldn't need to be stressed. They attached massive props, but because of this they needed a lot of ground clearance. Because the added height would have then resulted in a particularly long front landing gear strut, the whole nose bends down slightly to minimize its size. At the other end of the aircraft, the whole tail section has been slightly raised to lift it above the massive turbulence from the large props, and these are the reason why the aircraft has this very unique side profile. The designers also had a unique problem because it was outgrowing the aircraft hangars, which, by the way, the word hangar comes from the French word hangard, which means a shed for carriages. This was fine when aircraft weren't much bigger than carriages, but that was changing rapidly. To get around building a massive tail, like what you see on the 707, they used this triple tail design, where they're able to spread the vertical surface over 3 smaller tails rather than having a single large one. An interesting feature of the engine was that under heavy throttle you could see flames firing out the side, as you can see here if you look closely. Apparently at night they would close the curtains so that the passengers on board wouldn't be scared at seeing these flames. This Super Constellation, which by the way was featured in the Qantas safety video celebrating 100 years of flying, is based at the Havilland Aviation Museum just south of Sydney, and this regularly flies at air shows. It was powered by 4 Wright R3350 18-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines, producing around 3,250 horsepower each, but were notoriously unreliable. In fact, there was a joke that it was the best 3-prop airliner in the world because it would regularly land with at least one of the 4 props feathered and the engine turned off. The airlines who flew these would store spare engines throughout their network and share them between each other. While the Boeing 307 Stratoliner was the world's first pressurized airliner, and here's the one remaining example on display at the Smithsonian Museum in the USA, the Constellation and Superconnie were far more popular and was the first pressurized aircraft for Qantas and many other airlines. Being pressurized meant that it could now fly much higher without the need for extra oxygen and above bad weather. It also brought a much longer range, and this aircraft allowed Qantas to fly onto Europe and North America. In fact, from 1958, 2 Super Constellations would leave Sydney and fly around the world in the opposite direction, arriving home 6 days later. I'll show you inside this aircraft, including the cockpit, in another video, which I'll link to below.
The massive leaps in aviation continued in 1959 when Qantas joined the jet age with the Boeing 707, which we have behind me.
This aircraft was a lot faster, carried more passengers, and again flew even higher than the Super Constellation. The aircraft here, VHEBA, was interesting for two reasons. It was the first jetliner in their fleet, but it also came with a unique Qantas specification, as theirs were 3 meters shorter, while keeping the same fuel capacity so that it could cover longer distances across the Pacific Ocean. And here were the reasons for the improved performance: the jet engines. This aircraft was delivered with Pratt & Whitney turbojets, but they were replaced by turbofans, which would become the 707B, although the B sticker is missing on this display. I'll explain these engines by exploring this JT3D engine inside the museum. Air is sucked in through the front, where it is compressed, fuel is added, and it explodes out the back. It's that simple. But with new turbofans, 40% of the air bypasses the central hot core where the explosion happens and is purely pushed along by that big fan at the front. This added part didn't exist in the older turbojets. These make the engines more efficient and quieter. Newer engines, as you can see here with this RB211 from the 747, have even more air bypassing the hot core, so a considerable amount of thrust actually comes from just the fan at the front, a bit like a turboprop. Another benefit with the jets is that there are far less moving parts than the piston engines, so they were a lot more reliable. In fact, during 1963, for example, only 3 jet engines were removed for repair, in comparison with 58 piston engines 5 years earlier on the Qantas Constellations. Another significant change with the 707 were that the tickets were becoming increasingly cheaper. In fact, the 707 was the first Qantas aircraft to have more economy class seats than first class, but this was only the start of airfares for the masses.
In 1964, Qantas Imperial Airways were renamed as Qantas Airways in an effort to remove any real references to the British. And then in 1967, Qantas ordered 10 Concordes because they were meant to be the future of passenger aviation. Little did they know that that was actually this aircraft behind me. Now, I've grown up with aircraft like the Airbus A330, a regular occurrence at airports, but for many people, where aircraft like the DC-3 and then the 707 behind me, for them they were considered to be quite large aircraft, so then you can only imagine how surprised they were when they saw this brand new aircraft from Boeing, the 747, the Queen of the Skies. And it's actually quite understandable why a lot of people seriously thought that it may not even fly.
The first Qantas Boeing 747 arrived in 1971, and it carried over 3 times the number of passengers as the 707, hence why the ticket prices dropped dramatically, really opening up the world for so many more people. Qantas went on to purchase the SP model, the 200, the 300, and eventually the 400, which only retired in 2020. In fact, I was on the last commercial flight ever, and my video from that is on my channel. For a number of years before the 767 arrived, the entire Qantas fleet was made up of 747s, so it really played an important role in the airline. They had an iconic shape with the short upper deck, which Qantas used as their first-class Captain Cook lounge. These were eventually converted into regular seats, although the real reason for the upper deck is quite interesting. As I mentioned before, the future of passenger aviation was meant to be the Concorde, or Boeing or Tupolov's supersonic airliners. So Boeing expected that the 747 would primarily be a freighter. By having the flight deck higher up, they could open up the entire nose, allowing easy access for large freight. As we now know, supersonic travel didn't take off, and the 747 became what it is today. But it is interesting to note that demand for the passenger version did drop off several years ago, but production of the 747-8 freighter only just stopped recently, so freight remains an important part of their business case. Another fascinating design feature of this aircraft is the wing, which really is massive, although what you're seeing now is it in its smallest and sleekest setting. It has 3-part slotted flaps which extended from behind the wing, as you can now see in this footage I took on a flight several years ago. These increase the lift generated by an astounding 90%. The 747 is an iconic piece of engineering, and I've climbed all through this one, but that will be in a separate longer video on my channel. As well as being incredibly tall, another major change was the width of the cabin. As you can see here, the seats are in a 3-4-3 configuration with 2 aisles, while the 707 for comparison's sake, only had a single aisle and 6 seats across, similar to a 737 these days. This interior is in a luxury jet configuration, so you'll have to imagine the seating, but you can get the idea from its size. In fact, the 707 was originally planned to only have 4 seats across, which is what we saw in the Dash 8 prototype, and this is the actual aircraft that Tex Johnston barrel-rolled and is now on display at the Smithsonian Museum at Dulles Airport. But airlines wanted more seats, so the cabin was widened with the production model. While the 707 did fly non-stop across the Pacific Ocean, it really was the 747 that allowed Qantas to fly to many distant locations without stopping. These included routes to Johannesburg and Santiago, which actually fly underneath the world over Antarctica, so there's literally nowhere to stop. In fact, here's footage I took on board one of those flights several years ago. It was pretty magic to consider I was flying underneath the world upside down, well, sort of, in a Qantas Boeing 747. Keen observers will have noticed something unusual about the port side wing, and that's because it has 3 engines attached to it. As the turbofans became larger, they became much more difficult to send to stricken aircraft. So there is a 5th engine pod that can be attached to the 747, and they'll put an aerodynamic cover over part of the engine to reduce the drag, as it's not turned on during flights. In 2016, Qantas sent a spare engine over to Johannesburg, making for some great photos. I should note that other aircraft, including this Boeing 707 here, also had similar engine pods. While not on display here, I have to mention a few other important aircraft in the Qantas story. In 1985, the Boeing 767 arrived, and this wide-body twin remains with Qantas until mid-2024, when the final freighter version was retired. This was the first Qantas wide-body twin, and more advanced electronics made the flight engineer's job redundant. Prior to this, any large jet would have had at least 3 crew members in the cockpit. In 1989, the first 747-400 was delivered to Australia after a non-stop 20-hour and 9-minute flight from London Heathrow to Sydney, and that very same aircraft set the record for the shortest 747 flight in 2015 when it flew for just 12 minutes from Sydney to the Haas Aviation Museum in Shellharbour. That aircraft is now on display, and I've visited it in another video. Earlier I mentioned a unique 707 made for Qantas, while the tradition has continued with a unique 747-400ER, which stands for Extended Range and was only ever sold to Qantas. This entered service in 2002, and the changes included 1 or 2 extra fuel tanks in the forward cargo hold, and a strengthened fuselage and landing gear to handle the extra weight. Prior to this, they would have to reduce the number of seats sold and cargo flown to ensure that the 747-400 could cross the Pacific on certain routes like Dallas to Sydney. As anyone who has flown Qantas domestically will know, the backbone of their short-haul fleet is the Boeing 737. In 1992, Australian Airlines were sold to Qantas, introducing their 737 to the fleet, and they were later upgraded with the more modern 737-800s. These narrow-body twins remain in service and are a regular sight at any major Australian city airport. 1992 also brought Australian Airlines Airbus A330s into the Qantas fleet, which they have been flying since 1981. In 2002, the first Airbus A330-200 arrived, followed by the first A330-300 in 2003. These remain in service, operating both domestic and international routes. In 2009, the incredible Airbus A380-800 arrived, taking over as the Flying Kangaroo's flagship aircraft. Here's footage of one at Sydney Airport captured by the team at SID Squad. I'm sure you're aware of the live streaming at LAX Airport. Well, the same happens at Sydney Airport with regular high-definition streaming at sidsquad.com.au, and I'll link to their YouTube channel below. You barely notice because it's so large, but those massive wings flex 4 meters upwards when it takes off. In fact, they're designed to flex up to almost 7 meters during extreme turbulence. Each A380 consists of around 4 million individual components, with 2.5 million part numbers produced by 1,500 companies from 30 countries around the world. 19,000 bolts are inserted inside the fuselage to attach the 3 main parts, plus 4,000 to attach both wings. Qantas purchased 12 of these, 2 are retired, and it's expected that the remaining 10 will fly until 2032. In 2017, we saw the arrival of the first Boeing 787-9 Dreamliner, Victor Hotel Zulu November Alpha, and these wide-body twins now make up a major part of the international Qantas fleet. With 2 powerful engines, they're more efficient than the 747, even though they carry less passengers and cargo. Made out of composites, they're less susceptible to rust, therefore the cabins are a little more humid, so you don't feel as dry and dehydrated after a long-haul flight. This video was about Qantas aircraft, so I haven't included Qantas Link, although I've got plenty of videos on board their fleet, including the old 717 and the new A330 on my channel. If you're into aircraft, then this museum definitely should be added to your bucket list. You're able to do extra tours where you can crawl through these aircraft, and I couldn't recommend them enough. Just make sure you book those tours in advance. I have many more similar aviation videos on my channel, including longer guided tour videos through several of these aircraft, and flights on board some of the more modern aircraft I've mentioned later, so please check out my channel. I'd love to hear your stories of flying with Qantas over the last 100 years. Where was your first flight with them, and on board what aircraft? Please comment below. Thanks for watching.